Well, hello everyone. We are back down to being locked down, as you know, which is nobody's favorite thing for sure, but that does not prevent us from continuing to serve God and to glorify His name. We'll be going back to distributing these sermons online for a while, and I hope that this can be an opportunity for growth and for service and being a good example to our community, even in this difficulty. Let's go to God in prayer and then take a look at our lesson. Our God and Father in heaven, we thank you for this day. We thank you for always being with us, for watching over us. We pray that we would put you first in all that we do. We know that you are holy and that you are in control of all things. Please give us the strength to remain faithful to you and help us to be light shining in the world. Help us to grow closer to you each day. In Jesus' name, amen. So last week we began a new series on the 10 plagues, and I did not necessarily expect to be interrupted in the middle of that series by a lockdown, although maybe I should have. But that is okay. We are going to continue this series anyway. If you are just joining us now that we're back online and you have not heard the first part of this series, you still can listen to it. We have continued to post these recordings on our Facebook page, on the church website. Basically, wherever you are watching this now, you should be able to see last week's lesson still. So that one is titled The 10 Plagues, Part 1. And it's an overview of the plagues as a whole and why God is sending plagues against Egypt, why Pharaoh's heart is hardened and what exactly that means. It's a really interesting introduction, I think, to the plagues as a whole. And so I hope that you've had a chance to listen to that and that can be beneficial to you. What we're going to do for the next few lessons is to look at the plagues in cycles. One of the things I mentioned last week was you can divide the plagues up into groups of 3. And that's because each group of 3 follows the same pattern of a warning and plague, a warning and plague, and then a plague without a warning, one that comes suddenly. And that repeats. You have that 3 times until you get to the climax in the 10th plague. So we're going to follow that same pattern in this series by taking them a cycle at a time. So this lesson is the first cycle of the 10 plagues, with turning the Nile into blood, the plague of frogs, and then the plague of gnats. In Exodus chapter 7, verses 14 through 25, we read about this first plague. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water. Stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you, saying, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness. But so far you have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, and the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, take your staff and stretch out your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, their canals, and their ponds, and all their pools of water, so that they may become blood, and there shall be blood throughout all the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and in vessels of stone. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile, and all the water in the Nile turned into blood. And the fish in the Nile died, and the Nile stank, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile. There was blood throughout all the land of Egypt, but the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house, and he did not take even this to heart. And all the Egyptians dug along the Nile for water to drink, for they could not drink the water of the Nile. 7 full days passed after the Lord had struck the Nile. So Moses had gone to Pharaoh, had asked him nicely and respectfully to let the people go. He showed him a couple of harmless signs as an indication of God's power. But Pharaoh has chosen not to release the Israelites. So Moses, at God's instruction, goes out to meet Pharaoh in the morning at the bank of the Nile. You have to know how important the Nile River was to the Egyptians. Throughout history and all over the world, civilizations and people have sought out reliable sources of fresh water. The reason for that should be fairly obvious. We certainly need that, and it's important to have reliable access to it. But even Egypt is kind of a special case. Egypt is not a place that gets a lot of precipitation. They get about 2 inches of rain a year, and obviously that's not a lot. That's not enough to grow crops. It's not enough to really sustain a civilization, yet Egypt was a mighty empire. They had an unusual strategy that revolved around the Nile flooding each year. The river would flood, it would rejuvenate the soil, just enough so that certain crops could grow. They heavily relied on that flood. If it was a weak one, or if it didn't happen at all one year, they would be forced to rely on other food sources, which could cause shortages or even a famine. They believed that that yearly flood was a gift from their gods, specifically the god Happy, but others as well. And they diligently served and worshiped these gods so that they would bless them with a good flood. So if you weren't familiar with that, you might be wondering why the Nile is so important or why they would want a flood. We tend to think of floods as destructive events that we want to avoid. But in this particular case, they need it and they rely on it. Additionally, the whole nation lived in close proximity to this river. There wasn't much point in straying too far from the Nile because the rest of Egypt is pretty much desert. You're not going to be able to sustain a civilization of people in that kind of land. So if you were to compare the Egyptians with, say, the Romans who came later, the Romans established a whole network of roads to connect all their cities together. The Egyptians didn't have to do that exactly. The Nile was not only their source of water, their source of sustenance for the soil, it was also their superhighway. It was also the main transportation network to send people and goods all up and down the entire length of the nation. So imagine, like I said, most civilizations rely on these kinds of freshwater sources, but imagine if all of America were along the banks of the Mississippi River. How much more significant would that river be if we were all clustered like that? It's already an important river and has been for many years, but the importance of the Nile cannot be underestimated. It was crucial. So Moses tells Pharaoh what's going to happen, and right before his eyes, the river turns to blood. The fish died, the river stank, and the blood was everywhere. And it wasn't just the river, it was streams and pools and other water sources as well. But this lasted for 7 days. That's just long enough to get real thirsty and real panicked, for sure. The Egyptians were forced to dig around the river to find groundwater, to find anything that wasn't blood. I can't even imagine trying to drink and cook and bathe with something that foul and terrible. Yet, Pharaoh's magicians were able to replicate this plague in some way. And so this only strengthens Pharaoh's resistance. He hardens his heart. He's not affected by the power of this plague like he should be. And he simply turns around and goes back into his palace without a real response to Moses. So why is this plague the one that comes first? Well, we've already mentioned how important the Nile was to them. It was designed to strike at the heart of the nation, to catch everyone's attention. Pharaoh may have been willing to ignore it, but I doubt the nation was. This had to be an incredibly fearful thing for them. There would be incredible panic at the sight of their life-sustaining river turning into a symbol of death. There's another reason, though. Remember, back just a short time before this, Pharaoh was frightened that the Israelites were becoming too numerous and could revolt. Back in Exodus chapter 1, He decides to make their lives harder, to keep them beaten down into submission so that they would not have the strength or willingness to turn against him. I'm not totally sure how wise that was, but that was his rationale. But he went a step further than that even more than making their lives harder. He decides to commit a genocide against them. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 22, it says, "And the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, 'When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live.' But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, 'Why have you done this and let the male children live?' The midwives said to Pharaoh, 'Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them.' So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, 'Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live.'" Pharaoh wanted all the male babies killed as soon as they were born. But the midwives were not willing to do that, and they simply didn't. And so when it didn't happen, he ordered for them to be thrown into the Nile. He ordered for his own people to go and to take these baby boys and to throw them into the Nile to drown and die. And so the blood of the slain innocents cried out to Yahweh from the river. And we know that God sees and hears injustice. We know that God does not ignore those things. God does not simply let that go. Is it any wonder that God's first plague against Egypt was to take the Nile, what was supposed to be a blessing to them, a source of life to them, and to say, "You turned this into an instrument of death for so many innocent babies? I'll show you what it looks like as an instrument of death." That river turned into blood, and that struck terror into their hearts. That's the kind of terror they should have felt when Pharaoh gave that order to throw those babies in the river. It never should have happened, and it was a terrible and grievous thing that he did. The second plague, since Pharaoh has not listened with the first one, the second plague comes in Exodus chapter 8. Let's read verses 1 through 15. "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Go into Pharaoh and say to him, Thus says the Lord, let my people go, that they may serve me. But if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will plague all your country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs that shall come up into your house and into your bedroom and on your bed, and into the houses of your servants and your people, and into your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up on you and on your people and on all your servants.' And the Lord said to Moses, 'Say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the rivers, over the canals, and over the pools, and make frogs come up on the land of Egypt.' So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same by their secret arts, and made frogs come up on the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron and said, 'Plead with the Lord to take away the frogs from me and from my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to the Lord.' Moses said to Pharaoh, 'Be pleased to command me when I am to plead for you, and for your servants, and for your people, but the frogs be cut off from you and your houses, and be left only in the Nile.' And he said, 'Tomorrow.' Moses said, 'Be it as you say, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord our God. The frogs shall go away from you, and your houses, and your servants, and your people, they shall be left only in the Nile.' So Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried to the Lord about the frogs, as he had agreed with Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and when they gathered them together in heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was a respite, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, as the Lord had said." Well, after 7 days of the Nile being blood, it's back to normal, and Pharaoh's no closer to letting the people go. Moses warns him again that another plague is coming, and then follows through. The nation is swarmed with frogs. That sounds inconvenient, and it is, but it's a lot more than just inconvenient. I want you to consider how awful it really was. This is not like going outside and seeing that there are some extra frogs hopping around. There were so many frogs that their houses were full of them. They couldn't even get into bed without having to try to sweep away and clear away all of these frogs. I imagine that when they did get into bed, it wasn't long before the frogs were back up there with them. You wake up, and how many frogs do you have on you? Do you know how many times I've woken up in the morning with frogs in my bed? 0. That has never happened to me, and I don't expect it to. That's what they had to live with. There were so many frogs, they couldn't get away from them. So they wake up and they clear the frogs off of them, and they stumble out of bed to try to make breakfast and make food for the day. But oh no, there are frogs in your oven and frogs in your kneading bowls. That's not exactly like prime frog habitat there. So how many frogs must there be for them to be even in those bizarre places? Every single thing you do is punctuated with having to fight these frogs. You can barely walk from room to room. You can barely walk through a doorway without trying to avoid stepping on frogs. Every surface covered. What must that have sounded like, too? Frogs aren't even all that quiet a lot of times. It was terrible. It was a nuisance. It was gross. It was not very sanitary. It was a real plague upon them. But more than all of that, it was, like these other plagues, an attack on the pantheon of Egypt. In particular, this was an attack against Heket, the goddess of fertility and birth. To understand why, you have to think about this from an Egyptian point of view. When I think of frogs, I don't immediately think about fertility and birth, but they did. Because when the flood came each year, that was a sigh of relief for them, a good, powerful flood to bring new life for the coming year, to provide more food and more sustenance for them, and that would naturally bring an explosion in the population of frogs. And that would be a welcome sight. So much the same way that when spring comes and we see the leaves come back on the trees and the flowers start to bud and the birds flying about again, all those signs, that's about more than just those plants and animals. That's a symbol of rebirth, a symbol of new beginnings. Well, to them, the frogs were that symbol of new beginnings. The frogs were a symbol of something new coming for the year. And so it became a symbol of fertility and birth for them. And so Heket, the goddess of fertility and birth, was depicted as a woman with the head of a frog, the very model of fertility. These frogs this time, though, are not anything to celebrate. They're just a pain. And so Heket has either gotten out of control or she's angry with them. And both of those are very concerning. But of course, the magicians are able again to replicate the plague and to call forth more frogs to the land. But it's at this point that you might be wondering something. What are these magicians doing? If their whole point is to match God's power and to show Pharaoh that yes, Moses' God might be able to do this, but we're just as powerful, why are they doing it this way? Why aren't they reversing the plagues instead of copying them? When the land is filled with blood, do you need more blood? When the land is filled with frogs, do you really need more frogs? If they can reliably challenge God's power, I would think the best way to show that would be by taking away the frogs or converting the Nile back into water instead of letting it stay blood for 7 days. What's going on here? Well, it's evident to me that the magicians did not have real power. How could they? They had nothing more than tricks and illusions, and when there's lots of blood, you can use sleight of hand and such to make it look like you're turning water into blood. When you've got a seemingly infinite number of frogs around, you can probably make it look like that you are causing more frogs to spring forth, but you can't very well undo all of these plagues. And I think Pharaoh realizes that, at least on some level, because he abandons the plan of letting the magicians bail him out. Remember that as soon as he saw the magicians copy the first plague, he's now basically bored and just goes back into his palace. This time, they've brought forth more frogs, but Pharaoh's not completely satisfied. He realizes this is an issue and that the frogs need to go away. So he comes up with a new strategy, and we talked some about this last week. Pharaoh comes up with a plan to ask Moses to ask Yahweh to take the frogs away. Now, I don't want you to read that and to think that Pharaoh has had this sudden change of heart and he's suddenly cooperating. He's not. Pharaoh thinks that he's going toe-to-toe with God. He thinks that this is an epic duel between the leader of the gods of the Egyptians and some little local god of the Hebrews. Of course, that's not who Yahweh is, but that's who he thinks Yahweh is. A minor god for a minor, pathetic people who doesn't have the kind of power that Pharaoh does. And so he's going to use a little bit of trickery. He strikes a deal. He says, take the frogs away, and I'll let the people go. Moses agrees, and he says, when should I do this? Which is a fascinating question. I want to know why Moses asked it that way, but Pharaoh's answer is maybe even more fascinating. He says, tomorrow. Tomorrow? If you had frogs in every room and on every surface, would you put it off until tomorrow to get rid of them? It's bizarre, but there's a point to this. I think Pharaoh's trying to accomplish two things. One, he wants to ensure that Moses is not working some kind of trick here. If this is an illusion, if this is an elaborate prank, basically, then Moses is not going to be able to sustain it for very long. But if it can go for a whole other day, well, that's going to prove that there's some real power behind it. I think because Pharaoh is starting to realize his magicians rely more on tricks than real power, he's got to see what Moses is doing and if Moses has a similar kind of strategy. But additionally, I think what Pharaoh's trying to do is he's trying to act like this doesn't really bother him. So Yahweh has struck with this plague of frogs, and Pharaoh's saying, okay, yeah, that's great. You can take that away, please, and I'll cooperate, but I'm not really bothered by this. You haven't done as much damage as you think you have. So take them away, please, and I'll cooperate, but, if it goes another day, that's fine too. Basically pretending to be a big shot. That's the kind of attitude that Pharaoh has here. He is going to end up pulling a fast one on God, at least in his own mind. I'm being quite accommodating here to Pharaoh in what he thinks he's accomplishing. He thinks that he's going toe-to-toe with God. He thinks that he's in a real struggle and a real duel with him and that he's going to win some and lose some. Like we mentioned last week, that's not at all what is happening here. God is indulging Pharaoh for a time for a very specific purpose. He's letting Pharaoh puff himself up and raise himself up so that his fall will be even greater. But at this exact moment, when God takes away the frogs, although he takes them away by just having them all die, so you have heaps of rotting frogs everywhere, I'm not sure that's much better than it was before, Pharaoh reneges on his end of the bargain, and so it looks like that he's won something over on God. I got God to stand down, and look, the frogs didn't come back. So Pharaoh is on top. Pharaoh has the upper hand. What's going to happen next? Well, you think Pharaoh has the upper hand. He most certainly does not. The third plague comes, and here, at the conclusion of the first cycle, you get a little bit of a different pattern here. In Exodus 8, verses 16 through 19, Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, so that it may become gnats in all the land of Egypt." And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. But the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. For the conclusion of the first cycle, there is no warning given to Pharaoh. It is like God is saying, okay, you think that you came out ahead here? Here comes the third plague without any warning at all. Just in case you thought you were in control, we're going to remove that notion from your mind. What is this third plague exactly? Well, the word translated gnat here is a little bit uncertain, and it's up for some debate. In fact, your translation might not say gnats at all. It may say lice. And both of those are pretty good candidates for what this insect could be. The effect here is some kind of small, pesky insect that would bother them, that was not much more than just like living dust, basically, which is pretty much what gnats and lice are, but could bite and annoy and could be both a nuisance and a medical issue. So gnats or lice, I think, both fit pretty well. Some sort of small insect like that. To the Egyptians, it is as if the dust itself has come alive to assault them, which is disconcerting, to say the least. This plague is an attack against Geb, the Egyptian god of the earth. Geb was said to bring forth bounty and sustenance from the dirt and the land. But now something else is coming up from the dirt. Something else is coming up from the dust. It is rising up against the people. So either Geb has no control over it, or he has turned against them. And now you're starting to see the pattern that we talked about last week. That the implication throughout the plagues is that either the Egyptians have angered their entire pantheon, which is frightening to them and maybe the worst thing they could think of, or their entire pantheon has been overcome and conquered by the God of the Hebrews. And that is probably even more frightening than that most terrifying thing they could think of, because they wouldn't even consider that to be an option. What is one little god of a little people compared to the mighty Egyptian pantheon? You've got to look at this with pagan eyes on how they viewed these gods as basically national weapons. And the Egyptian pantheon was strong because the Egyptian nation was strong, and vice versa. So Geb is not protecting them. Happy was not protecting them. Haket was not protecting them. Are they all angry with them, or have they been overcome? Either way, this is very frightening. Herodotus, an ancient historian, tells us that the Egyptian priests had many rites of cleanliness and purification that they had to observe. And some of these were specifically to prevent them from being infected with bugs like lice, which is interesting, because that adds another layer to this. If they were afflicted in this way, which they would have been, since this is affecting everyone among the Egyptians, then they're unclean, and they're unfit to go before their gods. That's a serious thing when it's one priest who is supposed to be preventing that. What happens when it's all the priests? What happens when there's no one to go before their entire pantheon? If they weren't angry before, they will be now. God is showing who's really in control. He's saying not only can your gods not protect you, but now you can't even intercede to them on behalf of the people in the way that you think is fitting and proper. God is dismantling their whole system before their eyes. The dust itself is a common symbol across cultures of mortality and death and frailty. And that's because when we die, our bodies turn back into dust. Over time, we crumble into nothing. And so, we have the common expression, from dust thou art, and to dust you shall return. That's the pattern of life. And the Egyptians had the very effective tool of mummification, of trying to preserve bodies that they did for typically pharaohs. But that was important to them because they knew that dust is a symbol of that mortality. So they have the dust rising up against them to infect and to pester and to follow. This is a nagging reminder that death is at the door, that they cannot live forever because God is against them. So dust is that symbol of mortality and death. The insects themselves represent impurity and lack of devotion to their God. This whole thing is a terrible insult to the Egyptians and to their gods. So even though there's only a few verses here about this plague, it's actually quite significant and quite alarming to them. Again, we see that the magicians don't even attempt to remove the plague, but they do try to duplicate it again. However, this time they can't do it. And that's a twist. Maybe they would think this is because, now we're unclean. Now we can't go before our gods, and now they're not looking kindly upon us. But now our power seems to be gone. Now we do not have the ability even to imitate what Yahweh is doing. And so they finally admit, but they've been beaten. They say, this is the finger of God. And so from here on out, while they are still in Pharaoh's court, they either do not try or they can't succeed at even pretending to match God's power, much less take the plagues away. From here on out, the magicians are basically pushed to the side. So the first cycle is complete. And the biggest thing that's happened here is that Pharaoh's magicians are defeated. This is the first big step in showing Pharaoh that you cannot fight against God. Even though they acknowledge the finger of God, even though they see that they are outmatched, Pharaoh still resists. And it will take many more plagues to convince him. That's the first cycle. And what this shows us, most of all, is that God has power over water, earth, and air. He has power over all creation. It's all at his disposal because he made it all. It's his. The Egyptians and so many pagan cultures have divided creation up among these different gods and different spirits. There is only one true God, and he made it all. It's all his, and he has control over whatever he wants to do. The other lesson we can learn is that we sometimes think we are able to stand against God. We sometimes put ourselves in Pharaoh's position here, maybe not in literally claiming to be a god and claiming to have divine power. I don't know many who claim that sort of thing. But in other ways, we think that we can go toe-to-toe with God. We say things like, I know what God says in the Bible, but he'll know what I mean. He'll know that this is better for me. Or he and I will have a talk and we'll come to an understanding. Or we've decided as a group, as a church, that we're going to advance with the times and take the good thing that God started with and make it even better for this current age. When we say things like that, we are putting ourselves on equal footing with God. We're saying, God, you've got a lot of good things going for you, but I've got a counter to this point and to that. You're in that duel with God, that boxing match with God. And you know what? God doesn't often just strike people dead at that moment. And so you may think that you have won some kind of battle against God. People will say, if God really were offended, wouldn't he just send the bolt of lightning? Well, was God offended at Pharaoh? Did he strike Pharaoh down just yet? No. That didn't mean it wasn't coming. It didn't mean that judgment wasn't on its way. Sometimes God lets us build ourselves up so we can tear ourselves down. I'd strongly urge you not to do that. It's better to serve God, and it's better to to respect his authority and his power. Thank you, brethren and friends. This is, I think, a fascinating study as we're going into these 10 plagues. It's very tempting for us to look at these as just a miscellaneous collection of things that God did to Egypt, but there's so much more to it than that. Each one of these has special significance to the Egyptians, to the Israelites who are witnessing it, and there's so much for us to learn. And so thank you for your attention in this. Glorify God in all that you do, and stay safe and be well. Thank you.